The dust of Red Mesa, Texas, didn't just settle on things, it was a part of them. It was in the grain of the raw pine buildings, in the creases of every face, and in the back of every throat. In the late afternoon of a day in the 1870s that felt hotter than the hinges of hell, the wind blew this red grit like a fine sandpaper, polishing the world down to its rawest form. Inside the Mesquite House, the only two-story building in town that served as both inn and saloon, the dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the shafts of light slanting through the grimy windows. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap whiskey. A piano in the corner, played by a man named Cletus, whose face was a permanent mask of weary indifference, provided a tinny, disjointed soundtrack to the slow business of a Tuesday. Behind the long, scarred bar, Eliza Hart moved with an economy of motion that belied her 19 years. She was an orphan, a fact Red Mesa never let her forget, and the Mesquite House was the only home she'd known since the fever took her parents a decade ago. She was quiet, not from shyness, but from a deep-seated understanding that in a town like this, words were currency she couldn't afford to spend recklessly. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned up so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her serious gray eyes. She wore a simple, darned dress of faded calico, clean but perpetually smelling of wood smoke and lye soap. There was a pride in the straightness of her spine and the deliberate way she wiped a glass. A silent declaration that while her circumstances were meager, her spirit was not for sale. The swing doors creaked open, admitting a slice of blinding sunlight and a figure that made the low hum of conversation falter. Colt McRae did not enter a room. He occupied it. At 34, he was the owner of the Silver Spur Ranch, the largest cattle operation in the county. He was a wealthy man, a widower, and carried a reputation as solid and unyielding as the land he ran his herds on. He was known to be hard but scrupulously fair, a man whose handshake was a contract and whose silence was often more potent than another man's threat. He was dressed not in the finery of a cattle baron, but in the functional clothes of a working man, denim trousers worn pale at the knees, a plain cotton shirt, and scuffed leather boots. The grief of losing his wife and young son to a summer fever years ago had settled in his eyes, carving lines at their corners that didn't come from smiling. He moved to the far end of the bar, away from the handful of prospectors and drifters, and placed his hat on the counter. "Whiskey, Eliza," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Eliza nodded, her movements fluid and professional. She took a clean glass cleaner than most and poured a measure of amber liquid from an unlabeled bottle. She set it before him without a word. Their exchanges were always like this, brief, functional, respectful. He was a fixture in town, a man of immense influence, but to her, he was just a customer who paid his dues and kept to himself. From a corner table, another kind of power watched the scene. Silas Thorne, his fingers adorned with gaudy rings, ran the town's gambling and loan sharking operations from his velvet-draped corner of the saloon. He was a man who thrived on the weaknesses of others, his smile a greasy thing that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Beside him sat his wife, Eleanor, a woman whose virtue was as manufactured as the silk flowers on her hat. She fanned herself slowly, her gaze sweeping over Eliza with the kind of disdain reserved for an insect. To the Thornes, everyone in Red Mesa was a pawn, and they were merely waiting for the right moment to make their move. Silas saw Colt McRae not as a neighbor, but as a rival whose land and influence he coveted. He saw Eliza Hart not as a person, but as a potential lever. The afternoon bled into evening. The saloon filled. The piano grew louder. The air thicker. Cattle drivers, fresh off the trail with weeks of pay burning holes in their pockets, brought a new energy to the room, loud, boisterous, and edged with a careless menace. They drank hard and fast, their laughter echoing off the low ceiling. Eliza moved through the tables, collecting empty glasses, her face a neutral mask. She'd learned to be invisible, to navigate the currents of drunken bravado like a ghost. Most men, even in their cups, knew the unwritten rule the saloon girls were fair game for a certain kind of attention. But Eliza was different. She was the help, under the loose protection of the owner, and crossing that line meant trouble. But rules, written or not, were easily forgotten after the fifth whiskey. A big drover named Jed, built like an ox with a tangle of a beard, had been watching her all evening. His eyes, bleary and red, followed her every move. As she reached to clear a glass from his table, his hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. It was a grip of surprising strength. "Hold on there, pretty thing," he slurred, a foul grin splitting his face. "Where you hurrying off to sit a spell with us?" Eliza froze, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. "Let go of me, please," she said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the fear icing her veins. Jed's grin widened. Feisty. I like that. He began to pull her, intending to drag her onto his lap. The men at his table laughed, a chorus of crude encouragement. The piano stopped mid-note. Cletus's hands hovered over the keys, his face slack. The loud chatter of the saloon died away, replaced by a sudden, heavy silence. Every eye in the room swiveled to the scene. This was the kind of moment Red Mesa fed on a spectacle of power and humiliation. Eleanor Thorne leaned forward slightly, a flicker of cruel amusement in her eyes. Silas watched with the detached interest of a man weighing odds. Eliza's silent pride was cracking. The humiliation was a hot flush on her cheeks. She pulled against his grip, but it was like pulling against an iron shackle. I said. Jed growled, his good humor evaporating. "Sit down." Then, a new sound cut through the tension, the soft scrape of a chair on the wooden floor. Colt McRae had stood up. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't drawn his pistol. He simply rose to his full height and started walking toward the table. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace that was more intimidating than any charge. The floorboards groaned softly under his weight. He stopped beside the table. He didn't look at the other men, only at the big drover holding Eliza's arm. "Let her go," Colt said. The words were quiet, almost conversational, yet they carried the weight of a final judgment. Jed squinted, his brain struggling through a fog of alcohol to process this interruption. He saw the tall, broad-shouldered man standing over him, recognized the face of the Silver Spur's owner. A flicker of sense, of self-preservation, tried to penetrate the whiskey haze. "This ain't none of your business, McRae," he blustered, though his voice lacked conviction. His grip on Eliza's wrist tightened, a foolish act of defiance. Colt didn't raise his voice. He didn't even seem to tense. He simply looked down at the hand clamped on Eliza's arm. I won't say it again. There was no threat in the words. But the promise of consequence was absolute. It was in the stillness of his body, the cold fire in his dark eyes. It was the certainty of a man who had faced down stampedes, blizzards, and armed rustlers, and had never once backed down. The air crackled. The other drovers at the table sobered up instantly, shifting in their seats, suddenly wanting to be anywhere else. Jed looked from Colt's impassive face to the pale, determined face of the girl. He saw the tremor in her chin, the fight in her eyes, and he finally understood. He wasn't just tangling with a saloon worker. He was challenging Colt McRae. The calculation was simple. The risk was too high. With a curse, he released her wrist so abruptly that Eliza stumbled back a step. He shoved his chair back. "Hell with it. The whiskey's sour here anyway." He threw a few coins on the table and stomped toward the door, his companions scrambling to follow him out into the night. The swing doors flapped shut, leaving behind a silence that was louder than the previous noise. Eliza stood there, rubbing the red mark on her wrist, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was free, but as she looked up, she realized she had only been moved from one cage to another. Every eye in the saloon was now on her and Colt McRae. The whispers started almost immediately, a venomous hiss spreading from table to table. They didn't see a man defending a helpless girl's honor. They saw a transaction. They saw the rich rancher laying claim to a piece of property. The glances that passed between patrons were filled with speculation, with a sordid, knowing calculus. Silas Thorne's lips curled into a genuine smile now. This was a complication he could use. Eleanor's face was a mask of righteous indignation, her eyes branding Eliza with a silent, damning label. Colt seemed oblivious to the stares, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He walked back to the bar, his stride as measured as before. Eliza, recovering her composure, followed him, her movements stiff. She resumed her place behind the counter, her hands busy arranging glasses that were already arranged, desperate for a mundane task to anchor her. He picked up his half-finished whiskey and drained it in one swallow. He placed the glass on the counter and laid a silver dollar next to it, far more than the drink was worth. The coin gleamed in the lamplight, a stark and ambiguous statement. Was it payment for a drink, or for a service rendered for a girl saved or a girl bought? His eyes met Eliza's for a brief, unreadable moment. There was no warmth in his gaze, but no pity either. There was something else, something she couldn't name. A flicker of recognition, perhaps an acknowledgement of the steel he saw in her spine. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned, put on his hat, and walked out of the mesquite house, leaving the silver dollar and a maelstrom of gossip in his wake. Eliza was left alone, standing in the center of the saloon's silent judgment. She had been rescued from a moment of physical violation, only to be subjected to 1,000 smaller, sharper violations from the eyes of the town. She was no longer just the orphan girl who worked at the saloon. She was now Colt McRae's girl, in Red Mesa. A label like that, once applied, was as permanent as a brand on a steer. Cletus, the piano man, finally found his nerve and began to play again. The tune was slow and melancholy, a lament that seemed to match the quiet despair settling in Eliza's heart. She looked down at the gleaming silver dollar, a coin that represented both her salvation and her new prison. The red dust of the streets swirled in through the doors, promising another long, hard day to come. The silver dollar Colt McRae had left on the bar became the talk of Red Mesa. It sat in the saloon's cash drawer, separate from the other coins, a silent testament to the night that had changed everything for Eliza Hart. The story, however, did not remain silent. It grew, twisting and bloating with each retelling until the truth was a distant, unrecognizable thing. In the days that followed, Eliza learned the true weight of public opinion. The saloon, once a place of familiar drudgery, became a gallery where she was the sole exhibit. The whispers that had started that night were now bold, open-faced assessments. Men who had once barely noticed her now looked at her with a new, proprietary light in their eyes, as if Colt's intervention had made her public property. The women were worse. They would gather their skirts as she passed on the boardwalk, their gazes like sharp little stones, chipping away at her dignity. She was no longer Eliza, the quiet orphan. She was the rancher's fancy piece, a girl who had cleverly bartered a moment of distress into a rich man's protection. Silas Thorne watched the unfolding drama with the keen eye of a predator sensing an opportunity. He saw Eliza not as a person, but as a beautifully crafted lure. He understood the dynamics of a town like Red Mesa. Pride was a man's most vulnerable point. By possessing the girl Colt McRae had claimed, he could land a blow far more satisfying than any won at the card table. His interest in her became overt. He would linger at the bar, his compliments slick and unwelcome, his eyes undressing her spirit while his wife, Eleanor, watched from their corner table with a look of bored, venomous triumph. For Eliza, the mesquite house had shrunk. Its walls, which had once represented the entirety of her world, now felt like the bars of a cage, and the townsfolk were the spectators, poking and prodding through the bars. She moved through her days with her head held high, her face a carefully composed mask of indifference. But inside, a quiet desperation was taking root. A week after the incident, on a sweltering afternoon when the heat made the air tremble, the swing doors of the saloon creaked open. The room fell silent. It was Colt McRae. This time, he didn't head for the solitude of the far corner. He walked with purpose toward the center of the bar, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the floorboards. He stopped directly in front of Eliza. His shadow fell over her, a sudden eclipse in the dusty light. He took off his hat, holding it by the brim in one hand. The entire saloon held its breath. Silas Thorne leaned forward, a thin smile playing on his lips. This was it, the public claim. "Miss Hart," Colt said, his voice a low, even tone that carried to every corner of the silent room. Eliza met his gaze, her own gray eyes steady. "Mr. McRae, I have a business proposition for you," he stated, his words clipped and formal. He was not speaking to a woman he had rescued, but to a potential employee. "I'm in need of a housekeeper and cook out at the Silver Spur. The work is hard and the days are long. You'll have your own room in the main house. The pay is $20 a month, plus board." A collective, barely audible gasp went through the room. $20 a month was a fortune, more than a cowhand made for risking his neck on the trail. It was an absurdly generous offer for a housekeeper. It confirmed everything they suspected. Eliza's mind reeled. She stared at him, trying to decipher the meaning behind his stony expression. Was this a genuine offer? Or a more sophisticated way of buying her? Was he trying to save her from the fire? Or simply move her into a different, more comfortable furnace? "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Yet it seemed to echo in the stillness. Colt's gaze didn't waver. He seemed to understand the question behind her question. "My last housekeeper left to get married. My ranch hands are good men, but they can't cook worth a damn, and the house is collecting dust. I'm told you're a hard worker and your cooking is tolerable." He paused, and for the first time, his voice lost some of its businesslike edge. "It's real work, Miss Hart. For fair pay. And I give you my word. No one at the Silver Spur will bother you." The final sentence hung in the air, a direct and public promise. It was a shield offered in front of the very people who had been throwing the stones. He was not claiming her. He was offering her sanctuary, a clumsy, awkward, and very public sanctuary that would only feed the gossip. But sanctuary nonetheless. She looked away from him, her gaze sweeping over the faces in the room. She saw the sneering contempt on Eleanor Thorne's face, the predatory calculation in Silas's eyes, the crude speculation on the faces of the drifters. She saw the familiar walls of the mesquite house, the scarred bar, the out-of-tune piano. This was her cage, small and familiar. She knew the shape of its bars, the limits of her confinement. What he offered was a bigger cage, one she had never seen, on the sprawling, isolated land of a man she did not know, a man haunted by his own ghosts. But his promise, "No one will bother you," was a key. It might only unlock the door to a larger prison, but it was a key, and it was the only one she'd ever been offered. Freedom. She was beginning to understand. Wasn't a place, it was a choice. Even a choice between two prisons was still a choice. She looked back at Colt McRae, the quiet strength in his face a stark contrast to the ugliness surrounding her. She straightened her spine. "I accept your offer, Mr. McRae," she said, her voice clear and firm. "When do you want me to start?" "Now," he replied without hesitation. "Go get your things. The wagon's outside." The spell was broken. A low murmur erupted through the saloon. Silas Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. He had been outmaneuvered. Eliza untied her apron and laid it on the bar. She gave a single, brief nod to the saloon owner, who just shrugged. And then she walked away from the bar, past the staring faces, and up the stairs to the small attic room she called home. Her belongings were pathetically few. A single worn dress folded neatly in a small wooden chest, a Bible with a faded cover, her mother's name inscribed on the inside, a small, hand-carved wooden bird, a gift from her father that was the only tangible memory she had of him. She wrapped the bird in a spare chemise and placed it carefully in a small carpet bag. It took her less than 5 minutes to pack the entirety of her life. When she came back downstairs, a small crowd had gathered on the boardwalk outside, drawn by the news that was already spreading through Red Mesa like a prairie fire. As she stepped out into the harsh sunlight, a figure detached itself from the crowd. It was Eleanor Thorne, her face a perfect mask of feigned concern. "Why, Eliza, dear," Eleanor cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Leaving us so soon, I do hope you've secured a favorable arrangement for yourself. A girl with your background must learn to be practical." The insult was clear, wrapped in the guise of friendly advice. Eleanor was declaring to the entire town that Eliza was nothing more than a woman selling her favors. Eliza stopped. She looked directly at Eleanor, her gray eyes clear and cold as a winter stream. There was no anger in her expression, only a profound and weary certainty. "I'd rather sweep the floors for an honest man, Mrs. Thorne," Eliza said, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden hush, "than be a queen in a crooked card game." Eleanor's painted smile froze. A flush of angry color crept up her neck. She was left speechless, exposed. A few of the onlookers, a blacksmith and the grocer's wife among them, looked away, a hint of shame on their faces. Without another glance, Eliza walked to the buckboard wagon waiting at the end of the street. Colt was already in the driver's seat. He reached down and took her small bag, placing it in the back without a word. He offered a hand to help her up, and she took it. His grip was firm, calloused, and impersonal. She settled onto the hard wooden seat, keeping a respectable distance between them, and stared straight ahead, not allowing herself to look back at the town that had been her entire world. Colt flicked the reins, and the horses moved forward. The wagon rolled out of Red Mesa, leaving the dust and the whispers behind. The journey to the Silver Spur was a silent one. They traveled across a vast, sun-baked landscape, a world of red earth, hardy grasses, and the stark, skeletal shapes of saguaro cacti reaching for a bleached blue sky. The heat was immense, a physical presence that shimmered above the ground. The only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves and the steady creak of the wagon's wheels. Colt did not speak. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his profile as stark and unforgiving as the landscape around them. Once, he pointed with his chin toward a thin trickle of water seeping from a rock formation. "Alkali spring," he said. "Don't drink from it." It was the only thing he said for the first hour. His kindness, Eliza realized, was a practical, clumsy thing. He had given her a job and a promise of safety, but he had no talent for soft words or easy comfort. He was a man who communicated through actions, not conversation. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, they crested a low rise. Below them, nestled in a wide, shallow valley, was the Silver Spur Ranch. It was an impressive sight. A long, well-built bunkhouse, a massive barn, and a web of corrals spread out from a central point. And at that center, on a slight knoll overlooking the entire operation, was the main house. It was a 2-story ranch house, built of dark, sturdy timber and local stone, with a wide porch running its full length. It was the house of a prosperous man, solid and enduring. As they drew closer, Eliza saw that it was meticulously maintained. The windows were clean, the porch was swept, and there wasn't a loose board or a peeling patch of paint to be seen. Colt pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the house and set the brake. He got down and came around to her side. offering his hand again to help her down. "Welcome to the Silver Spur," he said, the words feeling formal and stiff on his tongue. He led her up the steps and opened the heavy front door. Eliza stepped across the threshold and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The inside was as immaculate as the outside. The floors were polished wood. The furniture was dark and heavy and well made. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. Its hearth swept clean. Everything was in its proper place. There was no dust, no clutter, no sign of the chaotic bachelor life she might have expected. But it was cold, not with a physical chill, but with a profound and echoing emptiness. The air was still. The house was utterly silent. It felt less like a home and more like a museum. It was clean because no one lived in it. It was tidy because no one disturbed it. This wasn't a house filled with life. It was a fortress built to keep memories in and the world out. Eliza looked at the perfectly arranged chairs, the dust-free mantelpiece, the cold, clean hearth, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had escaped the small, noisy cage of the mesquite house, only to find herself standing in a vast, silent, and beautifully furnished tomb. The first weeks at the Silver Spur were governed by a rhythm of silence and routine. Eliza rose before the sun, the chill of the high plains air sharp in her lungs. She would light the stove in the vast, quiet kitchen, the scrape of the match and the whoosh of the flame, the only sounds to break the pre-dawn stillness. She cooked for the ranch hands hearty breakfasts of bacon, biscuits, and coffee that one of the men, a kindly older vaquero named Jose, would carry down to the bunkhouse. Then she would cook for Colt McRae. He ate alone in the kitchen, at a small table by the window. Their meals were silent affairs. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man who saw food as fuel, not pleasure. He would nod his thanks when she placed the plate before him, and nod again when she cleared it. He never complimented her cooking, but he always cleaned his plate, a gesture she learned to interpret as the highest form of praise he was capable of giving. After breakfast, her time was spent battling the house itself. It was a beautiful prison of memory, and her job was to be its warden. She dusted furniture that was never used, polished silver that was never set out, and swept floors that were never sullied by laughter or company. She found clothes belonging to a woman and a small boy neatly folded and packed away in cedar chests. She touched the soft flannel of a child's shirt and felt a pang of sorrow so sharp it was like a physical blow. This house was not empty. It was full of ghosts, and she was an intruder in their silent domain. Her life was measured and solitary. The ranch hands were polite but distant, treating her with a sort of respectful caution. They saw her as the boss's business, and on a ranch, you didn't meddle in the boss's business. Colt was a constant, looming presence, either out on the range, a distant figure on horseback, or in his study, a closed door at the end of the hall. He had kept his promise. No one bothered her, but the profound loneliness was a weight of its own. Her duties often took her outside, to the well for fresh water or to the smokehouse for cured meat. It was on one of these trips that she found the spot, beside the well. There was a patch of earth, maybe 20 feet square, that lay barren and exposed. The sun had baked it to the consistency of a brick, and the wind had scoured it clean of all but the most stubborn weeds. It was an ugly, forgotten patch of land. But Eliza saw something else. It was close to the well, the only source of life-giving water for miles. It faced east, meaning it would get the morning sun but be spared the worst of the afternoon's brutal heat by the shadow of the house. It was a scar on the face of the otherwise orderly ranch, a place of potential. An idea, quiet and stubborn, took root in her mind. She could make something grow here, in this house of preserved memories and stifling silence. She could create life. It was a foolish, impractical notion. The soil was poor, the sun was a tyrant, and the wind was a relentless thief. But the thought would not leave her. To cultivate a piece of this hard, unforgiving land felt like an act of defiance. It was a way to claim a small piece of this world for herself. She found a rusty spade and a heavy hoe in the barn. The next morning, after her chores were done, she went to the patch of earth and struck the ground with the spade. The tool bounced off the baked soil with a jarring thud that vibrated up her arms. The ground would not yield. She struck it again and again, putting her whole weight into it. A few dry crumbs of red dirt were her only reward. For days, this became her private battle. Every afternoon, she would spend an hour or two fighting the earth. The work was brutal. The sun beat down on her, and the dry wind chapped her lips and whipped strands of hair into her eyes. Blisters rose on her soft hands, then broke, leaving the skin raw and tender. She would work until her back screamed and her arms trembled with exhaustion. Her simple calico dress dark with sweat. From the porch of the main house, or sometimes from the window of his study, Colt watched her. He said nothing. He saw her grim determination, the set of her jaw, as she fought a seemingly hopeless war against his land. He saw her bandaged hands, the smudge of red dirt on her cheek. He saw a resilience that reminded him of something he had long tried to forget. He felt a stir of an emotion he couldn't name, an unsettling mix of admiration and a deep, aching sadness. One morning, Eliza went out to the well and stopped. Leaning against the stone wall was a burlap sack. It was heavy, and it smelled earthy and rich. It was manure from the stables, the finest fertilizer for amending the poor soil. There was no note, no explanation. It was simply there, a silent, practical offering. A few days later, she found a roll of canvas and 4 sturdy wooden posts left in the same spot. It was a means to create shade, to protect a fledgling garden from the worst of the sun. Again, no words were exchanged. Colt left for the range before she was up and returned long after she had finished her work in the garden. But his message was clear. It was a clumsy, non-verbal admission asterisk. I see you. I will not stop you. I might even help. The silent gifts opened a door. Just a crack. One evening, she was in the kitchen, soaking her raw hands in a bowl of warm water and Epsom salts. Colt came in to get a drink from the water bucket. The silence between them was different, less a wall and more a shared space. She looked down at her hands, then spoke to the water in the bowl. "Thank you for the supplies, Mr. McRae." He stopped, the dipper halfway to his lips. He followed her gaze out the window to the small, tilled square of earth, now dark and rich where she had worked in the manure. He was quiet for a long moment, his throat working. "Sarah tried a garden there once," he said, his voice rough, as if the words themselves were unused to the air. "My wife." Eliza froze, her hands still in the warm water. He had never spoken his wife's name. The sun was too much for it. He continued, his gaze distant, fixed on a memory only he could see. "She planted roses. They burned up before they could bloom." He took a drink of water, the sound loud in the quiet kitchen. "She was delicate, not made for this country." He set the dipper down with a soft click. He seemed about to leave, to retreat back into his fortress of silence. But he stopped, his hand on the doorframe. "Our boy, Tommy, he would have liked what you're doing," he said, his back still to her. "He liked watching things grow, always digging in the dirt, looking for worms." And then he was gone, leaving Eliza alone in the kitchen with the ghosts he had just summoned. He had shared a piece of his pain, a tiny, fractured shard of his story. He had given her their names Sarah and Tommy. It was more intimate than any touch, more meaningful than 1,000 empty pleasantries. He was letting her see the reason for the house's coldness, the source of its unending silence. With a new sense of purpose, Eliza finished preparing the soil. She acquired a small packet of seeds beans, squash, and corn from a traveling peddler she flagged down on the main road. With her own money. This had to be hers. She planted them with a reverence she didn't know she possessed, pushing each seed into the dark, amended earth like a prayer. She built a small fence of scrap wood around the plot to keep out critters and stretched the canvas over it during the hottest parts of the day. Every morning and every evening, she drew water from the well and gave her garden a drink, her sweat mingling with the water that nourished the soil. Weeks passed. The Texas sun was a relentless hammer. The earth was a thirsty mouth. Every day she checked the soil, her hope warring with the harsh reality of the land. Nothing happened. The plot remained a square of dark, barren earth. The silence of the house seemed to be mocking her efforts. Then, one afternoon, the sky began to change. The endless pale blue was bruised with shades of gray and purple from the west. The wind, usually hot and dry, picked up a new scent, the cool, damp smell of rain. The ranch hands looked to the sky, their faces a mixture of hope and disbelief. Unseasonal rains were a rare and unpredictable blessing. By evening, the clouds had swallowed the sky. The world grew dark. The first drop of rain hit the dusty ground with a hiss, then another and another. Soon, a steady drumming began on the roof of the house, growing into a powerful downpour. Thunder rolled across the plains, and flashes of lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, momentary flashes. Eliza stood at the kitchen window, watching the rain lash against the glass, washing the dust from the world. It was a violent, cleansing storm, and she felt a sense of profound relief, as if the rain were washing away not just the grime of the land, but the accumulated sorrow of the house. The storm passed just before dawn. The morning broke clear and cool. The air scrubbed clean. The world smelled of wet earth and sagebrush. As soon as her morning chores were done, Eliza walked out to her garden, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp ground. She knelt by the fence, her heart pounding, and she saw it. Pushing defiantly through the wet red earth were dozens of tiny, vibrant green shoots, 2 small leaves on each one, unfurling toward the morning sun. They were fragile, yet miraculously strong. They were alive. A smile broke across Eliza's face, the first genuine, unguarded smile she'd had in months. It felt like a sunrise inside her. Jose, the old vaquero, was crossing the yard and saw her kneeling there. He saw the green shoots, and he saw the look on her face. He paused, touched the brim of his hat, and a wide, deep smile creased his own weathered face. Eliza stayed there for a long time, just looking. Her hands, calloused and stained with earth, rested on the damp wooden fence. It was a small victory in a vast, indifferent world, but it was a start. She had taken a dead piece of ground and coaxed life from it. In the quiet heart of the Silver Spur, something new was finally beginning to grow. The garden became the quiet heart of the Silver Spur. Under Eliza's patient hands, the barren patch of earth transformed. The cornstalks grew tall and straight, their green leaves rustling in the dry wind like a whispered promise. Squash vines, thick and vigorous, snaked across the tilled soil, their broad leaves offering shade to the ground beneath them, and the bean plants climbed the simple trellises she had built from scrap wood. The garden was an oasis of life and order in a world defined by dust and distance. It was more than a source of food. It was a testament, a daily declaration that even in the hardest ground, something beautiful could be coaxed into existence. The change in the house was subtle but profound. Fresh vegetables graced the table, adding color and flavor to the monotonous ranch fare. The silence, once absolute and oppressive, was now punctuated by the rhythms of Eliza's work, the soft thud of a hoe in the dirt, the gentle slosh of water from the well, the quiet hum of a hymn as she weeded the rows. Even Colt seemed to have softened, the hard lines around his eyes easing almost imperceptibly. He never spoke of the garden, but sometimes, as he rode in from the range, he would rein in his horse and watch her for a long moment, a stillness in his posture that was no longer just about grief, but something akin to quiet contemplation. But peace, in this part of Texas, was a fragile thing. A wind from town began to blow, carrying with it a poison that could not be seen, only felt. The first sign of trouble came when Jose and another hand found a long section of fence cut on the northern pasture. The wire was snipped clean through in a dozen places, allowing a score of prime cattle to wander off toward the rough country. It took 2 days of hard riding under a merciless sun to round them up. Colt inspected the cut wire himself, his face grim. It wasn't the work of rustlers. Who would have driven the cattle off? This was vandalism, an act of pure malice meant to cost him time and money. A week later, the water in Willow Creek, which fed the main trough for his largest herd, slowed to a muddy trickle. Investigating upstream, Colt and his men found a crude but effective dam of rocks and fallen logs, deliberately built to divert the flow away from Silver Spur land. It was another clear message. These were not random acts of misfortune. They were calculated attacks. A quiet, undeclared war had begun. The whispers from Red Mesa, carried to the ranch by the occasional peddler or supply wagon, had curdled into something uglier. The story of Colt's generous job offer had been twisted into a sordid tale of a transaction. He hadn't hired a housekeeper. He'd bought himself a woman. The $20 a month wasn't a salary. It was a price. The narrative, championed by Silas Thorne and his cronies, painted Colt as a hypocrite and Eliza as a conniving opportunist who had traded her virtue for a comfortable life. Eliza heard the rumors, and though she held her head high, the words stung like alkali dust in a fresh wound. She had built a small, fragile world of dignity for herself at the ranch, and the poison from town was seeping in, threatening to kill it just as surely as a drought would kill her garden. She resolved not to be a prisoner. She needed supplies, flour, salt, seeds for the next season, and the peddler wasn't due for another month. She would go to town herself. "I need to ride into Red Mesa," she told Colt one morning, her voice steady. He looked up from his breakfast, his expression unreadable. "It's not safe." "I'm not a child. Mr. McRae, I won't hide. Hiding is what they want." He studied her for a long moment, seeing the steel in her spine. He gave a single, curt nod. "Take the buckboard. Be back before dusk." The ride into Red Mesa was tense. The town seemed different now, charged with a latent hostility. As she tied the wagon up in front of the general store, she could feel the eyes on her. The women who whispered behind their hands, the men on the saloon porch who stopped their conversations to stare at her with leering, speculative looks. She ignored them all, her face a calm mask, and went about her business. She had just finished loading her supplies into the wagon when a shadow fell over her. "Miss Hart," a smooth, oily voice said, "a pleasure to see you gracing our humble town again." She turned. It was Silas Thorne. He was dressed in a black suit, a diamond stick pin in his cravat glinting in the sun. He blocked her path, his smile as false as a $3 bill. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice cool and level. She made to step around him. He moved with her, blocking her again. "In a hurry. A woman of your new stature should learn to enjoy a slower pace." His eyes roamed over her, an insulting appraisal that made her skin crawl. "It seems you've landed on your feet. McRae's a lonely man, but his land, that's even lonelier. Not much water, I hear." "I don't know anything about that," Eliza said, her hand tightening on the wagon's side rail. "If you'll excuse me." "That's the thing," he said, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I could help with that. A man like me has influence. Water rights can be renegotiated. Fences can be protected." He let the words hang in the air. "A smart woman sees an opportunity. She aligns herself with the future of this valley, not its past." "What are you saying?" she asked, though she already knew. His smile widened. "I'm saying McRae's fortress is cold. His money is old. I'm offering you a different proposition. A true partnership. Be my wife." "Eliza." The words were a mockery of a proposal. A business transaction laid bare. "Together. You and I could own this town. You'd be a queen, not a hired servant. And as for the silver spur, well, a wife's property often becomes her husband's, doesn't it? The raw, predatory ambition in his eyes was sickening. It was all there, his desire to humiliate Colt, to steal his land and water, and to possess her as the ultimate trophy. He saw her as nothing more than a pawn in his greedy game. Eliza felt a surge of cold, clean anger. She looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze unwavering. "My answer, Mr. Thorne, is no. I would rather die of thirst in a desert than drink from your poisoned well." She pushed past him, her shoulder brushing his expensive suit, and climbed into the wagon seat without a backward glance. She slapped the reins, and the horses lurched forward, leaving him standing there, the smile finally gone from his face, replaced by a look of pure, reptilian fury. Shaken but resolute, Eliza had one last stop to make. The blade on her favorite kitchen knife had come loose from its handle. The blacksmith, a burly, honest man named Peterson, was the only one she trusted to fix it properly. She pulled up near the smithy, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on anvil filling the air. As she climbed down from the wagon, a group of 3 men who had been lounging in the shade of the building's overhang took notice of her. She recognized them as regulars from Silas Thorne's card tables. "Well, look what we have here," one of them drawled. "A lanky man with a stained duster. It's the Queen of the Silver Spur herself." His companions snickered. Eliza ignored them and started toward the wide, open door of the smithy. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the man said, stepping into her path. "What's McRae paying for your services? Maybe we can match his price." The insult, so crude and public, hit her like a physical blow. Her face flushed with shame and anger. "Get out of my way," she said, her voice tight. "Ooh, she's got spirit," another one laughed. "I like that. Bet she gives the old man a real ride for his money." Before she could react, the steady ringing of the hammer from inside the smithy stopped. The doorway darkened as a large figure emerged, wiping his hands on a leather apron. It was Peterson, the blacksmith. His face was grim. "That's enough, boys," he said, his voice a low growl. "Leave the lady be." "Stay out of this, Peterson," the first man sneered. "This is between us and the rancher's whore." The final word hung in the hot, still air, ugly and unforgivable. And then another figure appeared in the doorway. Stepping out from the shadows of the forge, it was Colt McRae. He had been inside, discussing an order for new branding irons. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His eyes were like chips of ice. He didn't say a word. He simply walked toward the 3 men. They saw him coming, and a flicker of fear crossed their faces, but it was too late to back down. The lanky one, puffed up with false bravado, took a swing at him. Colt moved with a speed and economy that was terrifying. He deflected the clumsy punch with his forearm and answered with a single, straight right hand to the man's jaw. The sound was a sickening crack, and the man crumpled to the dust, unconscious. The other 2, momentarily stunned, charged him at once. Colt met them without hesitation. He sidestepped one, sending him sprawling with a boot to the back of the knee, and caught the other with a short, brutal punch to the gut that doubled him over. Gasping for air, it was over in less than 5 seconds. 3 men were on the ground, groaning or silent, and Colt McRae stood over them, his chest rising and falling evenly. He hadn't been brawling, he had been dispensing a swift and terrible justice. He hadn't done it with a swagger or a shout. He had done it with the grim efficiency of a man protecting something vital. He looked at the men on the ground with utter contempt, then turned his back on them. His eyes found Eliza's. She was standing by the wagon, her hand pressed to her mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs. He walked over to her, his gaze scanning her face, searching for any sign of fear or injury. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and rough. She could only nod, unable to speak. He had fought for her. Not for his property, not for his pride, but for her honor, without another word. He helped her onto the wagon seat, untied the reins, and climbed up beside her. He drove them out of Red Mesa, leaving the fallen men and the gawking townspeople behind. That night, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. The sky was torn open by jagged streaks of lightning, and thunder cannonaded across the valley. Shaking the very foundations of the house, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, and rain came down in solid, driving sheets. Eliza was in the kitchen, unable to sleep, watching the storm through the window. The world outside was a chaotic swirl of darkness and flashing light. Suddenly, a new light appeared, a frantic, unnatural orange flickering from the direction of the barn. Fire. The cry came from the porch. It was Colt. Eliza's blood ran cold. She threw the door open and saw it. Flames were licking up the side of the horse barn, greedily consuming the dry timber. Through the wind and rain, she saw dark figures on horseback galloping away from the ranch, disappearing into the stormy darkness. The ranch hands, roused by the alarm, were already running from the bunkhouse with buckets. Colt was shouting orders, trying to organize them, his voice battling the roar of the wind. But the storm, which had provided cover for the attackers, now became their unlikely enemy. The heavens opened completely. The rain intensified, turning from a downpour into a deluge. It hammered down on the barn roof, hissing as it struck the flames. Water streamed down the walls, dousing the fire, turning the bright orange to a sullen, steaming black. In minutes, it was over. The arson had failed. The rain had won. Eliza and Colt stood side by side on the porch, soaked to the skin, watching the last of the embers die. The smell of wet ash and smoke filled the air. The attack had been repelled by a sheer act of nature, but the message was as clear as the charred black scar on the side of the barn. The war was no longer about cut fences or poisoned words. It had come home to the Silver Spur, and the next time, they might not be so lucky. The house was a fortress against the storm. Outside, the wind screamed like something wounded, and the rain lashed against the timber walls in furious, horizontal sheets. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle and pop of a fire in the stone hearth and the ragged rhythm of their breathing. The warm, flickering light cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar room into a world of its own, isolated and adrift in the chaos of the night. They were both soaked, their clothes dripping onto the polished wooden floor. The immediate danger of the fire had passed, but the adrenaline still coursed through their veins, leaving a metallic taste in their mouths. The scent of rain, wet wool, and the lingering acrid smell of scorched wood hung heavy in the air. Colt stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames. His broad shoulders slumped with a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. His right hand, which had connected so solidly with the jaw of Silas Thorne's man, was scraped raw across the knuckles. "Sit," Eliza said, her voice quiet but firm. She gestured to a sturdy armchair near the fire. For a moment, he seemed not to have heard her. Then, he turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just his housekeeper, but a woman who had stood unflinching in the face of public scorn and now stood soaked and shivering in his house after an attack meant for him. He moved to the chair and sat without a word. Eliza went to the kitchen and returned with a bowl of warm water, clean cloths, and a small bottle of carbolic acid. She knelt on the hearthrug in front of him, the firelight warming her face and turning her damp, honey-colored hair to threads of gold. She took his injured hand in hers. His skin was rough and calloused, the hand of a man who worked his own land, but he held it still, allowing her gentle ministrations, as she carefully cleaned the scrapes, dabbing away the grime and blood. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. The storm outside was a physical manifestation of the turmoil they were in, a violent, External force trying to tear them apart. It was Silas Thorne's men, Colt said finally, his voice a low rumble, stating a fact that needed no confirmation. The fire. I know, Eliza whispered, her eyes fixed on her task. This isn't your fight, he said, his voice laced with a rough edge of guilt. I brought this on you. She looked up then, her gray eyes meeting his. They called me a name today, Mr. McRae, in front of the whole town. You made it your fight then. I suppose that makes it mine now, too. His jaw tightened. The memory of the word, so ugly and vile, thrown at her because of him, was a hot coal in his gut. A man has a right to defend his own? And what am I, she asked, the question so soft he almost didn't hear it over the wind's howl. Am I your own? Mr. McRae, am I a piece of property, like your land or your cattle, to be defended when another man tries to claim it? The question struck him with the force of a physical blow. He stared at her, at the quiet pride in her face, the fierce intelligence in her eyes. He saw the years of being an orphan, of being looked over and looked down upon, of being defined by everyone but herself. He had offered her a job to save her from one kind of cage, only to realize that in the eyes of the world, he had simply locked her in another, gilded one. No, he said, the word torn from him, rough and immediate. That's not what you are. She finished tying a clean strip of linen around his knuckles, her touch light and sure. She sat back on her heels, the bowl of reddened water beside her, and looked into the fire. All my life, she began, her voice trembling slightly, I have belonged to no one, and because of that, everyone thought they had a claim on me. The town council that sent me to the orphanage, the saloon owner who gave me a bed in exchange for endless work, the men who thought a stray girl was theirs for the taking. I learned to build a wall inside myself, a quiet place where no one could touch me. She wrapped her arms around her knees, a gesture of self-protection. When you offered me this job, I hoped it would be a different kind of wall, a real one, made of wood and stone, a place to be safe. A tear traced a clean path through a smudge of soot on her cheek. Then another. She didn't sob, but the tears fell silently, relentlessly, a testament to a grief and a fear she had held in for a lifetime. But it's not, is it? She whispered. The talk followed me here, and now the fire has followed the talk. They don't see a woman you hired. They see a woman you bought. And Silas Thorne, he sees a prize to be stolen. I'm just an object. The shame of it. It's a heavier weight than any bucket of water I've ever carried. Colt felt a helplessness he hadn't known since he'd stood by the graves of his wife and son. He was a man of action, of fences and cattle and the hard logic of the land. He didn't know the language of comfort. He reached out, his uninjured hand hovering awkwardly in the air, before he let it rest gently on her shoulder. The contact was electric, a spark of warmth against her damp, trembling frame. She flinched, not from his touch, but from the raw emotion of the moment. All the walls she had so carefully constructed were crumbling. She was exposed, vulnerable, her spirit laid bare in the firelight. The fear of being owned, of being used, of being nothing more than a pawn in a man's world, was a suffocating terror. The plea that escaped her lips was a fractured whisper, a prayer against all the harshness she had ever known, a desperate appeal to the one man who had shown her a sliver of kindness. Her voice was a thread of sound, nearly lost in the storm. "Go easy," the naked virgin begged. The words, strange and stark, hung in the air between them. He understood. It wasn't a plea of the body, but of the soul, naked, not of clothes, but of all defense, a virgin, not in flesh, but in the terrifying, uncharted territory of trust, a plea for him to be gentle with the fragile, battered core of her being that she had just laid at his feet. He leaned forward, his face close to hers, the firelight carving deep shadows on his rugged features. His voice was a hoarse, low rasp, thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. No easy in the Wild West. The words were a stark, brutal truth. He would not lie to her. He would not offer her false comfort or promises of a gentle world that did not exist. Their life was hard, and it was about to get harder. He let that truth settle between them, a foundation of cold, hard reality. Then, he moved his hand from her shoulder to her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. He made her look at him, his dark eyes boring into hers, holding her captive with their intensity. He spoke again, and this time, his voice was clear, each word deliberate and weighted with the solemnity of an oath sworn on hallowed ground. "But I choose you, forever." The storm raged on outside, a wild and untamed thing, but inside the house, in the warm glow of the fire, a different kind of storm had broken and passed, leaving behind a profound and binding stillness. It was not a declaration of passion, but a covenant of survival, a choice, freely made, in the heart of the tempest. Two lonely, besieged souls, choosing to stand as one against the wind and the fire. The weeks following the storm were a time of tense, watchful quiet. A fragile peace settled over the Silver Spur, but it was the peace of a battlefield between skirmishes, not the peace of a tranquil home. Every shadow seemed longer. Every gust of wind sounded like a footfall. Colt and his hands worked with a new, grim purpose, reinforcing doors, checking their ammunition, and riding the fence lines not just for stray cattle, but for human predators. Colt and Eliza moved around each other in a new orbit, defined by the words spoken in the heart of the storm. His promise, I choose you, forever. Was not a whisper of romance, but a declaration of alliance. The barrier of employer and housekeeper had dissolved, replaced by a silent, profound partnership. He started talking to her about the ranch, about his plans for the herd, about the subtle signs of the changing seasons, and she, in turn, shared the quiet wisdom of her garden, the simple truth she had learned from coaxing life from the hard earth. They were two solitary people learning the language of we. The attack came on a night as black as the inside of a tomb. A sliver of a new moon offered no light, and a blanket of high, thin clouds had swallowed the stars. The air was still and cool, carrying the sweet, dry scent of cut hay and the earthy smell of the cattle settled in their pens for the night. A profound silence had fallen over the plains, a silence that felt heavy and unnatural. The first warning was the sudden, frantic barking of the ranch dogs, a sound that was cut off with a series of sickening yelps. Colt was out of his chair before the last yelp faded, the rifle he now kept perpetually near the door already in his hands. "Eliza, get down," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. "Stay away from the windows." She dropped to the floor behind the heavy oak table, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. From the bunkhouse, she heard a shout, followed instantly by the deafening crack of a rifle shot. And then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from 3 sides at once. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like demonic fireflies, revealing the positions of men hidden behind the corrals, the water trough, and the low rise to the west. Bullets thudded into the thick timber walls of the house, splintering wood and shattering the glass of the front windows. It was a coordinated, overwhelming assault, a siege laid by a small, disciplined army. Colt returned fire from a side window, his shots measured and deliberate. He wasn't wasting ammunition. Each shot was aimed at a muzzle flash, intended to suppress and discourage. The hands in the bunkhouse, led by Jose, were doing the same, turning their simple quarters into a fortified position, but they were badly outnumbered. "They're trying to pin us down," Colt grunted, reloading with swift, practiced movements. "They'll make their real move soon." As if on cue, a new, terrifying light bloomed in the darkness. It came from the direction of the massive hay barn, a flickering orange that grew with terrifying speed. They had set it ablaze, a giant torch to illuminate the battlefield and sow chaos. The dry hay caught with an explosive asterisk whoosh asterisk, and flames roared toward the black sky. casting the entire ranch in a hellish, dancing light. The terrified lowing of cattle, especially the calves in the pen adjoining the barn, became a sound of pure panic. But a new, sharper fear gripped Eliza's heart. Jose and his wife, Maria, lived in a small cabin just beyond that barn, with their 4-year-old son, Mateo. Through the shattered window, she could see the cabin silhouetted against the inferno. The fire was spreading, carried on the night air, and sparks were already landing on its dry, shingled roof. Mateo, she breathed, the name a prayer and a curse. Colt heard her. He glanced at the fire, then at her face, and he understood. Stay here. Eliza, that's an order. But she was already moving. This wasn't a fight that could be won with a rifle. This was a different kind of battle. While the men were locked in a deadly exchange of lead, the fire was the enemy that would consume them all. She crawled on her hands and knees to the back of the house, away from the main direction of the gunfire. She slipped out the kitchen door into the night, keeping low, the roar of the fire and the crack of rifles filling her ears. The heat was already intense, the air thick with smoke that burned her lungs. She ran, bent double, using the shadows of the outbuildings as cover. Her objective was not the cabin. She could see that Maria was already outside, trying desperately to douse the spreading roof fire with a bucket. Jose was pinned in the bunkhouse, but Mateo was nowhere in sight. He would still be inside the cabin, terrified. And between the cabin and safety lay the calf pen, a scene of chaos. The young animals, their eyes wide with terror, were surging against the wooden fences, their cries pitiful. The main gate was on the far side, exposed to the gunfire. They were trapped. Then Eliza remembered. On the backside of the pen, hidden from the main yard, there was an old loading chute, a narrow channel used to guide cattle onto wagons. Its gate was seldom used, secured only by a heavy iron pin and a thick wooden latch, not a padlock. It led out to a narrow, dry wash that offered a path away from the line of fire. She reached the small cabin, the heat scorching her skin. "Maria!" she screamed over the din. Maria turned, her face a mask of terror and soot. "Mateo, he's under the bed. He won't come out." Eliza didn't hesitate. She plunged into the smoke-filled cabin. It was hard to breathe, and her eyes streamed. "Mateo," she called. Her voice choked. She dropped to the floor and looked under the simple rope bed. 2 wide, terrified eyes stared back at her from the darkness. "Come on, sweet boy," she said, her voice a forced calm. "We're going to play a game. We have to be quiet as mice and follow me." She reached under, and his small hand gripped hers like a vice. She pulled him out. He was shaking, clutching a small wooden horse. She scooped him into her arms, his small body trembling against hers, and ran back out into the night. The back chute, she yelled to Maria, "Get the calves moving that way." Carrying the boy, Eliza scrambled toward the rear of the pen. A stray bullet whizzed past her head, so close she felt its heat. She didn't slow. She reached the chute gate, the wood hot to the touch. The iron pin was stiff with rust and disuse. She pulled, her muscles straining, but it wouldn't budge. Desperate, she looked around and saw a heavy piece of a broken wagon wheel hub lying in the dirt. She grabbed it, and using it as a hammer, she began to smash at the pin. The sound was lost in the greater chaos. She struck it again and again, her raw hands screaming in protest, until with a final, jarring blow, the pin shot free. She threw her weight against the wooden latch, and it splintered, the gate groaning open. Maria, understanding Eliza's plan, was already at the other side of the pen, waving her apron, shouting and pushing the terrified calves toward the opening Eliza had created. One by one, then in a frantic rush, the young animals poured into the narrow chute and scrambled down into the relative safety of the dry wash. With Mateo still clinging to her neck, Eliza followed them, helping a final, struggling calf through before she slipped into the wash herself. She huddled there with the boy and the frightened animals, her body shaking with reaction, the roar of the battle, and the fire still raging above them. She had saved a child. She had saved the future of the herd. She was no longer a person to be protected. She was a protector. Just as it seemed the battle would rage until no one was left standing, a new sound cut through the night. It was the thunder of a dozen or more horses, approaching at a full gallop from the east, from the direction of Red Mesa. A voice, amplified by authority and fury, boomed across the valley. "In the name of the law, drop your weapons. This is Sheriff Hank Boyd. You are surrounded." For a moment, the firing faltered. The attackers, caught between the determined defense of the ranch and this new, unexpected force, were thrown into confusion. Then, the sheriff's posse opened fire, their shots coming from the flank, turning the tide in an instant. The change was immediate. Silas Thorne's hired guns were mercenaries, not martyrs. Their will to fight evaporated. Curses and shouts echoed in the darkness as they broke ranks, mounted their horses, and fled into the night, pursued by the sheriff and his men. The battle was over. A new kind of silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire, the whimpering of Mateo, and the ragged breaths of the survivors. Slowly, Eliza made her way back up from the wash. Maria ran to her, grabbing her son, her face wet with tears and gratitude. The ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse, battered and smoke-stained, but alive. Eliza's eyes searched for Colt. She saw him leaning against the corner of the house, his rifle on the ground beside him. He was alive, but his left sleeve was dark with blood, and his face was pale in the flickering firelight. She ran to him. "You're hurt." He looked down at his arm as if just noticing the wound. "It's just a graze." He looked past her, his gaze falling on the empty, smoke-blackened calf pen, and then to the small, huddled group of animals and people emerging from the wash. His eyes finally came back to her face, covered in soot, her dress torn, but her spirit burning brighter than the flames. The look in his eyes was one of awe. He saw not a housekeeper, not a victim, but a partner, a warrior. The sheriff rode back into the yard, his face grim. They scattered. He said to Colt, "But we'll get them. I'm declaring this an attempted massacre. Silas Thorne has finally shown his hand." The law had awakened. The balance of power in the valley had irrevocably shifted. Eliza picked up a bucket that had been discarded in the fighting. It was still half full of water. She walked over to the smoldering ruins of the hay barn, where small flames still licked at the blackened timbers. She threw the water onto the largest remaining ember. It hit with a loud hiss, and a cloud of white steam billowed into the night air. The water foamed and bubbled on the hot ash, a churning symbol of life conquering destruction. As the last bit of fire was extinguished, the first pale, gray light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky. They had survived the night. Hope, battered and scarred, had won. The pale, watery light of dawn revealed the full extent of the night's violence. The Silver Spur Ranch looked like a haggard survivor of a brutal war. The air was a foul cocktail of smoke, gunpowder, and damp ash. The great hay barn was a blackened, skeletal ruin, still steaming in the cool morning air. The house and bunkhouse were pocked with bullet holes, scars that would forever tell the story of the siege. Sheriff Hank Boyd, a man whose weary face was etched with the lines of too many compromises, stood in the center of the yard, his expression hard as granite. The night had changed him. The tacit understanding that had allowed Silas Thorne's corruption to fester in Red Mesa had been shattered by the open warfare. This was no longer a matter of gambling debts and strong-arm tactics. This was an attempt at mass murder. "He tried to wipe you out, Colt," Boyd said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He nudged a spent rifle cartridge with the toe of his boot. "All of you, men, women, a child." His gaze drifted to where Maria was sitting on the cabin steps, holding a sleeping Mateo, her face streaked with soot and tears. Colt stood beside him, his left arm in a crude sling Eliza had fashioned from a torn tablecloth. His face was a grim mask, but the cold fury in his eyes had been honed to a fine, sharp point. He wanted the land. Hank, he wanted the water. He wanted to make an example of me. He's done that. All right, the sheriff said, his jaw tight. He's made an example of what happens when a town lets a wolf into the sheep pen and pretends it's a dog. He looked around at the ranch hands, at Jose, whose face was a thundercloud, at the other men whose exhaustion was mixed with a burning anger. Then his eyes settled on Eliza, who was quietly distributing mugs of hot, strong coffee. He saw the way she moved, the quiet strength in her posture, the resolve in her gaze. He had heard the story from a breathless Maria, how she had saved the boy, saved the calves, how she had faced the fire and the bullets. The town's gossip had painted a picture of a conniving woman. The reality was a hero. "This ends today," Boyd declared, his voice ringing with an authority he hadn't used in years. "I'm riding back to town. I'm deputizing any man with a steady hand and a spine. We're going to pay a visit to the Velvet Den." Colt nodded slowly. "My men and I are with you." "No," the sheriff said, holding up a hand. "You've done your fighting. You stay here, tend to your wounded, and guard this ranch. This next part is for the town to do. It's our debt to pay." As Sheriff Boyd and his posse rode out, a different kind of army was already being mustered in Red Mesa. The news of the attack on the Silver Spur had spread through the town like a prairie fire at dawn. It wasn't just gossip this time. It was a shock to the town's very soul. The first to act was Peterson, the blacksmith. He had seen with his own eyes the kind of scum Silas employed. He shut down his forge, the ringing of his hammer replaced by a determined silence. He walked to the general store, where a small, anxious crowd had gathered. You all heard Peterson's voice boomed through the store. Thorne's men tried to burn Colt McRae out last night, tried to kill everyone at the Silver Spur. A woman and her little boy were nearly burned alive in their beds. A murmur went through the crowd. These were no longer rumors. This was a fact, delivered by a man they all trusted. "And that girl," Peterson continued, his voice dropping slightly, "the one you've all been whispering about. She's the one who ran into the fire and pulled that boy out, while hired guns were shooting at her." A profound, uncomfortable silence fell over the group. The faces of the women, in particular, registered a deep, collective shame. They had judged Eliza, condemned her with their whispers and their scorn, while she had been quietly cultivating a garden and, when the time came, risking her life for a child. "Silas Thorne has been bleeding this town dry for years," Peterson went on, his anger building. With his crooked games and his impossible loans, "He thinks he owns us. He thinks he can get away with murder. Is he right?" From the back of the crowd, a cattle driver spoke up, a man who had lost his saddle to one of Thorne's dealers. "What can we do? He's got a dozen hard cases on his payroll." "So do we," Sheriff Boyd said, appearing in the doorway, his face grim. Behind him stood his 2 deputies and a handful of ranchers from the other side of the valley. "I'm looking for men who are tired of living under Silas Thorne's thumb. I'm going to his saloon. I intend to arrest him for conspiracy and attempted murder. I'm asking the citizens of Red Mesa to stand with the law." It was a tipping point. The fear that had held the town in thrall for so long was finally outweighed by their anger and their shame. One by one, men stepped forward. The store owner, who had been paying protection money to Thorne for months. The cattle driver, 2 farmers who were on the verge of losing their land over a loan from Silas. A line had been crossed, and the town of Red Mesa was finally ready to cross it with their sheriff. The Velvet Den was quiet when they arrived. Silas Thorne was in his office, confident that his men had either succeeded or scattered, leaving no trail back to him. He was planning his next move, how he would offer a pittance to a grieving widow for the fire-ravaged Silver Spur. He looked up in annoyance when the bat-wing doors were thrown open with a crash. He saw Sheriff Boyd standing there, flanked by his deputies. Then he saw the men behind them. Peterson, the blacksmith, holding a sledgehammer as if it weighed nothing. The grocer, The farmers. A crowd of grim-faced, armed citizens filling the street, their faces set with a resolve he had never seen before. "Silas Thorne," the sheriff's voice boomed. "You're under arrest." For a moment, Silas was just confused. Then he laughed, a short, ugly bark. "On what charge?" "Hank disturbing my morning brandy." "Attempted murder," Boyd said, his voice flat. "Conspiracy? Arson? Shall I go on?" Silas's face paled. The professional gamblers and hired thugs inside the saloon began to reach for their weapons, but they stopped as they saw the sheer number of armed men backing the sheriff. The odds, for the first time, were not in their favor. "You have no proof," Silas sneered, his bravado returning. "We have a dozen witnesses at the Silver Spur," the sheriff countered. "And I imagine we'll find a few of your boys who are willing to talk in exchange for a shorter rope." A short, brutal firefight erupted as one of Thorne's most loyal gunmen made a desperate move. But it was over almost as soon as it began. The townsmen, fueled by righteous anger, were overwhelming. The gunman went down, and the others, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, threw down their weapons. Silas Thorne, the man who had ruled Red Mesa through fear and intimidation, was dragged out into the street, his fine suit dirtied, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. They found his ledgers in his office, a meticulous record of every debt, every threat, every piece of land he planned to acquire. It was a blueprint for his intended empire, and it was the final nail in his coffin. As Silas was locked in the town jail, a different kind of confrontation was happening on the main street. Eliza had ridden into town with Colt to give her official statement to the sheriff. As she was leaving the jailhouse, a group of women, led by the grocer's wife, Mrs. Gable, approached her. They stood before her, their faces a mixture of humility and profound regret. Eleanor Thorne was not among them, stripped of her husband's power and money. She had become a social ghost overnight. "Miss Hart, Mrs. Gable began, her voice unsteady. We came to say we're sorry." Eliza stood still, waiting. "We heard what you did," another woman added. "For the little Mateo, running into that fire." "We were wrong about you, Mrs. Gable said, meeting Eliza's eyes directly. "We judged you unfairly. We listened to whispers instead of our own hearts. What you did, it was the bravest thing this town has seen in a long time. We would be honored if you could find it in you to forgive us." Eliza looked at their faces, at the genuine remorse in their eyes. The bitterness that had taken root in her heart began to dissolve. She gave a small, weary nod. "There's nothing to forgive," she said softly. "The slate is clean." In the days that followed, the town began to heal. The Velvet Den, the symbol of Thorne's corruption, was seized by the town council. Its gaudy furniture and gambling tables were unceremoniously hauled out and burned in a great bonfire in the street. By public consensus, the building was to be repurposed. The downstairs would become a proper town hall, and the upstairs, with its many small rooms, was to be converted into a schoolhouse, with a new teacher to be hired from Fort Worth. Back at the Silver Spur, the physical act of healing and rebuilding had begun. Colt, his arm healing but his resolve stronger than ever, organized the work. Neighbors from surrounding ranches, men who had once kept their distance, rode in with wagons full of timber and supplies, offering their help. The charred skeleton of the hay barn was torn down, and the foundation for a new, larger one was laid. Eliza found her purpose not just in the kitchen or her garden, but in tending to the community. She made poultices for the injured, cooked great pots of stew for the volunteer work crews, and spent hours with Maria, who was still shaken from the attack. One afternoon, as the frame of the new barn began to rise against the blue Texas sky, the sound of a child's laughter echoed across the ranch yard. It was Mateo, chasing a grasshopper near Eliza's thriving garden. his earlier terror forgotten in the simple joy of a sunny day. Colt and Eliza stopped their work, standing side by side, watching him. It was a sound that had been absent from the Silver Spur for too long. It was the sound of the future. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they no longer haunted the house. They were simply a quiet part of its story. This ranch was no longer a fortress of grief. It was becoming a home, built not just of timber and stone, but of courage, forgiveness, and the shared work of a community choosing to heal itself. A year passed. The seasons turned, painting the high plains in broad, sweeping strokes of color, the pale gold of summer grass, the deep rust of autumn, the stark bone white of a brief, hard winter, and finally, the tender, hopeful green of spring. On the Silver Spur Ranch, the changes were more than just seasonal. They were woven into the very fabric of the place. The black scar on the land where the hay barn had burned was gone, replaced by a new, larger structure, its raw pine timbers already weathering to a soft silver gray. It had been built not just by Colt and his men, but by the hands of their neighbors, a monument to a community that had chosen to stand together. The ranch was no longer an isolated fortress. It was a hub. On Saturdays, wagons would pull into the yard, bringing families from miles around to trade goods, share news, and let their children play in the wide, open spaces. The sound of Mateo's laughter was now frequently joined by the cheerful shrieks of other children. But the most profound transformation had taken place in the small patch of earth beside the well, Eliza's garden. Once a desperate act of defiance against a barren landscape, was now a lush and bountiful paradise. Tomato vines, heavy with ripe, red fruit, climbed their stakes. Fat, orange pumpkins rested on the dark soil, their leaves like great green hands. Rows of sweet corn stood like a miniature army, their tassels catching the sunlight like spun gold. It was a riot of life, a testament to what patience, water, and unwavering care could create. The garden had healed the land, and in doing so, it had healed the people. Eliza, who had arrived as a skittish outsider, was now the quiet, steady heart of the ranch. The women from town, once her tormentors, now sought her out, asking for advice on canning, for cuttings from her herbs, or simply for a moment of her calm, reassuring presence. She had found her place not by fitting in, but by creating a space where everyone felt they belonged. The change in Colt McRae was the quietest, yet the most significant of all. The fortress around his heart, built of grief and solitude, had been dismantled, brick by silent brick. The deep, abiding sadness that had lived in his eyes for so long had not vanished, but it had made room for something else. He still didn't smile often with his lips, but he smiled with his eyes, a warm crinkling at the corners when he watched Mateo try to rope a fence post, a look of deep, quiet pride when he looked at Eliza moving through her garden. The ghosts of Sarah and Tommy were no longer chains holding him to the past. They were gentle memories, allowed to rest in a heart that had found the courage to live again. One late afternoon in early autumn, the air was warm and smelled of sun-baked earth and ripe fruit. A gentle breeze rustled the cornstalks, making them whisper their dry secrets. Eliza was in the garden, her hands covered in dark, rich soil, carefully tying up a stray tomato vine. This was her sanctuary, the place where she felt most herself. She heard the soft crunch of boots on the path behind her and turned, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Colt stood there, watching her. He wasn't in his dusty work clothes. He had changed into a clean shirt, and he held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously by the brim. "Colt," she said, her voice soft. She had long since stopped calling him Mr. McRae. "Is something wrong?" "No," he said, his voice a little rough. "Nothing's wrong." He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. his gaze sweeping over the vibrant life of the garden. "You did all this," he said, more to himself than to her. "You took a piece of dead ground and made it the most alive place in the whole valley." "The land was good," she replied simply. "It just needed a chance." He looked at her then, his dark eyes filled with an emotion so deep and clear it made her breath catch. "So was I. Eliza," he said softly. "I was just dead ground, too." He took a step closer, and then, to her astonishment, he slowly knelt before her. He didn't kneel on the clean path. He knelt in the garden bed itself, on the damp, dark earth she had tilled and nurtured with her own hands. His knee sank slightly into the soft soil. "Colt, what are you doing?" she whispered, her heart beginning to pound. He looked up at her, his face earnest and stripped of all its usual defenses. The hard rancher, the stoic widower, was gone. In his place was just a man, vulnerable and hopeful. "That night," he began, his voice low and steady, "in the storm, I told you I chose you. I said it in the dark, with the wind howling, when we were scared and fighting for our lives. But that's not enough. A choice made in the dark isn't the only one that matters." He reached out and took her dirt-stained hand in his calloused one, holding it gently. "I choose you in the daylight, Eliza Hart, with the sun shining and the whole world quiet. I choose you when things are hard, and I choose you when they're good. I choose your strength, and I choose your kindness. I choose you with my whole heart, for all the days I have left." He paused, taking a breath. "I'm asking you to choose me back. Will you be my wife?" Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, not of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. This was the moment she had never, in her wildest dreams, allowed herself to imagine, to be seen, to be wanted, to be chosen, not out of pity or necessity, but out of love. She knelt down in the dirt with him, her clean dress forgotten. She cupped his rugged face in her free hand, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "Yes," she whispered, the single word holding a lifetime of hope. "Yes, Colt, I will." Later, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of molten gold and deep violet, they stood on the hill overlooking the valley. The new barn stood proud and strong. Below them, the cattle of the Silver Spur grazed peacefully, their hides glowing in the warm, slanted light. In the distance, they could see the town of Red Mesa. It was no longer a place of judgment and fear. The lights beginning to twinkle in the windows were not from a crooked saloon, but from a town hall where honest men debated the future, and from a new schoolhouse where children were learning to read. Justice had been served. Silas Thorne was serving a long sentence in a federal prison. His empire of greed crumbled to dust. The town, forced to confront its own soul, had chosen a better path. A warm breeze, the kind that promises a cool, peaceful night, drifted up the hill, carrying the scent of grass and distant wood smoke. There were no more malicious whispers on that wind. There was only the sound of the world settling into a well-earned peace. Colt slipped his arm around Eliza's waist, drawing her close. She leaned her head against his shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence. Two people who had found each other in the dust and the chaos, who had weathered the fire and the storm. Theirs was not a story of easy love. It was a story of a love that was as strong, as resilient, and as real as the land itself. A love that had to be cultivated, defended, and, like the rarest and most precious of things in the Wild West, chosen every single day. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We're curious, where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. It helps more than you know.